what can be some of the signs and symptoms, or what is some of the ways that mycotoxins can impact, I guess, on our health then?
Yeah. So the different areas in the body that it impacts is immune. So it's immune toxic. These mycotoxins are GI toxic. They can actually cause leaky gut syndrome and winnow away the lining of our GI system. So it gets in the way of so many things that have to do with health. They're skin toxic, so you can get rashes. They're toxic to our liver and kidneys, which are organs of detoxification. They're gene toxic, so they can actually rewire the genes to make us more immune deficient and susceptible. And they're neurotoxic, so they're a nerve toxin. And so we can see some kind of strange neurological, excuse me, sec.
That's okay.
Sorry, I didn't want to have you edit anything. So the nerve toxic part makes it these strange things like ear ringing, pelvic pain, atypical MS, or it just might be that whatever your tricky nerve thing is, if it's sciatica, it makes it a little worse. It can actually, some of these can go through the brain as well and irritate the brain, and that causes a lot of anxiousness and brain fog and fatigue and that kind of thing. So as far as categories, you see why a lot of doctors are missing this, because it's like everything. Yeah. And the mycotoxins are fat soluble. That's what makes them very unique. And when I'm teaching the doctors, I think, now think about all of the places that makes a difference. The brain is mostly fat. Our nervous system is lined by fat. Myelin sheathing is fat. Our fat is fat, but also our glands and organs are coated in these linings. Every single cell of our body is coated with fat. Our mitochondria have a membrane of fat. So these mycotoxins can get all the way down to that level, down to the mitochondria and down to the genes, which is terrifying.
Yeah.
So for me in clinic, I created a questionnaire. If there's any practitioners listening, you're welcome to the questionnaire. You can just email me through my website. It's a clinical questionnaire that gives someone a risk score of probability that there might be mold as a cause for their symptoms. I put it in the book as well, in the front of the book.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask whether it's the same
version. Yeah.
Okay.
Same thing. Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
Yeah. So have you had a chance to take the questionnaire?
You know what? I haven't sort of actually taken it, but I've gone through it sort of reading the book. It's terrible that I didn't just do it at the time, but it's on the to-do list, certainly.
It's good to do before you start learning about mold, just so you get sort of a baseline, unadulterated
kind
of thing.
Yeah, I'm certainly curious about it, because it seems to be almost, let me try and put this in a sensible way, within my client sort of cohort, it seems to be almost at epidemic proportions.
Yes.
So many of my clients come back positive for mycotoxins.
Yes, and I think I was reading, our OSHA estimates that over 25% of all buildings here have had enough water damage to host toxic mold. More than 50% have had water damage. So, that gets tossed around a lot. Like, whoa, no, it's 50%. Not all water events are going to grow toxic mold, but they do estimate that about a little over 25% have had enough to host these toxic molds. And I was reading that in the UK that's higher. That's quite a bit higher. Do you find that to be true?
I think so. I think maybe just because of, we've got so many old properties as well. But the number of clients I've had recently I have one client who literally was having mushrooms growing in their bathroom. It was that sort of severe. It's not a rare situation. I had a client just before our call, a new client who for the last 25 years has been basically trying to manage his health. He had depression as a teenager, and ever since then there have been all sorts of different symptoms and diagnoses. And he's incredibly sensitive to carbohydrates. He's come back positive on IgG testing, which he had done previously, to yeast, and I think he mentioned milk as well. He's just a very sensitive person, and interestingly, his entire family have some element of a health issue, which does stem back to when he was 15 years old. So I guess there's this theory, which is, the property had some degree of water damage, mold, and mycotoxins, and potentially it was influencing all of them.
Mm-hmm. And what we see, and this is what makes my treatment and my theories a little bit different from the general understanding with like Dr. Shoemaker and things like that, is what my understanding, and the theory could be wrong, but I base my treatment protocol off this theory. So the treatment's working, but if it's, feel free to correct my theory, but it seems to be that once someone is exposed to that water damage building, that the symptoms and the conditions is sort of on a continuum. So the initial thing is that you get that exposure and your own flora gets alarmed, because your own flora are all of these things too. If we did testing of sick people, sick from a water damage building, and healthy people, we would find the same bacteria and primarily the same fungus in everybody's sinuses. The difference between the healthy people and the sick people is now the sick people, if you do nasal washings, you can find mycotoxins. So my understanding of that is that if you're exposed to a water damage building at a certain degree, and that's going to be based on your genetic susceptibility, your nutrition status, your previous exposure to water damage buildings, but you get that exposure and your own flora starts to make mycotoxins.
Huh.
And then if that goes on long enough, then it can become immune deficiency, and you get that
Right.
disruption of the fungal balance in the body, like you were talking about, carbohydrate intolerance, candida overgrowth, that kind of thing. And then if that goes long enough, then the actual molds from that building can move into your sinuses and into your lungs. And that's when we see invasive fungal infections. So
Okay.
on this continuum, though, the very beginning of that continuum is your own flora reacting because it doesn't feel safe anymore. So
Huh.
your sinu biome turns into biofilm, pathogenic biofilm. So what that means is that someone can, the reason I came to that theory, because I was like, how can it be that this exposure was in college
Mm.
20 years ago, and there's no evidence of water damage exposure since then, and you're still sick with mold? And I think it's because that thing that it can trigger that to turn on. And now you've got an internal milieu that is basically making endogenous toxin. So that's why I do antifungals, and that's why I make sure that we treat systemically and intranasally, because so many times just that another moldy hotel exposure or moldy restaurant or the gym or, church or something like that, or you go to camp, and it can trigger all of this old stuff up again.
Mm. Yeah, it does seem that people have, as you say, a spectrum of sensitivity, because I have some clients who feel like they know if there's a mold issue in a property, because they'll walk in and it will just kind of hit them in the face, sort of symptomatically. They will
Mhm.
be aware they've just reacted to something in that environment.
Absolutely. Yeah. I call those mold canaries. They're like the canaries in the coal mine, and
Right.
they're great to have around. Like, you have one of them in your group, because if they're reacting, that you need to get out of there.
Yeah.
That's the thing, is that if it doesn't have to smell musty. It They won't smell musty unless those spores are exposed to the air. So if they're trapped behind building materials, mycotoxins have no scent at all. So
Mm.
you could be walking into a building and the mold canary knows there's mold in there, but nobody else can sense it.
Yeah.
So they're a great friend to have in your in your group. They keep you
Yeah.
protected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, and with this idea that mycotoxins, they can have an impact on the flora, and there is almost an antibiotic type element to this scenario.
Yes.
I I'm working on sort of almost an audit at the moment, because I'm starting to think that a lot of my people who do have mycotoxin issues often come back with suboptimal microbiome diversity in some of the stool test markers that some of the labs do. Is that something
Hmm.
that makes sense and that maybe you've seen?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. We see microbiome kind of things just completely disordered.
Mm,
You'll see a reduction in diversity in the bacteria and an increased diversity in the fungal.
yeah. Okay.
Because there's no
Excellent.
competition. They're
Yeah.
basically inhaling antibiotics. Isn't that crazy?
That is
I mean, when
crazy.
we really just step back, and then also the toxins. So I have a joke, inhale water damage air, get drunk, because it's the same kind of alcohols that we would make in beer and wine and
Mm,
liquor. that you're inhaling. So that's why we see brain fog, fatigue, visual disruption, a lot of the things that we would see with somebody who's intoxicated.
Yeah, and I add, this might be sound a little bit extreme, but I have clients who just wake up hungover and they haven't been
Yes.
drinking. And I've
Yes,
always kind of put it
exactly.
partly to that as a potential explanation,
Yep. Yeah, good call. That's right.
which is, not good when you don't have to drink and you're waking up
No.
with with a hangover.
No. And also, if they're exposed to some of these mycotoxins that can cross the blood-brain barrier, they're
Mm,
not necessarily getting the melatonin that they need. And we know that melatonin
right.
is one of the best brain antioxidants there is. So I put melatonin in my book for that very reason, because I find that if I can add it to someone's protocol preemptively before we go killing the mold or resetting the fungal balance, is really the way I think of it more. Um, that when what we've seen in studies is that when you start to administer an antifungal, so amphotericin B on an aspergillus species, fumigatus, it will kick up its production of gliotoxin. So we know that when we start to target these fungi that have overgrown, they're going to defend themselves.
Mm,
And so that's part of the treatment that I have, is that, we have to really prep the body to be ready for that. But that whole thing about waking up hungover, a lot of these people don't have enough melatonin. They're using up all of it in the inflammatory response.
hmm, interesting.
Yeah.